The fall of Jerusalem rang through Europe like iron on an anvil. 3 crowns answered. In Germany, Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa took the cross. In France, King Philip II. In England, Richard, newly crowned and already hungry for renown. It was a crusade of kings, money counted by mints, fleets ordered by royal writ, and an expectation that the West, armed as never before, would wrench the holy city back. Barbarossa chose the hardest road, overland. In 1189, his army, tens of thousands on contemporary lips, perhaps a disciplined corps of 12,15,000 fighting men, moved along the Danube, through Hungary and the Balkans, to Constantinople. Relations with Byzantium were brittle. Isaac II Angelos feared a Western army camped at his gates. After tense negotiations and skirmishes on the march, Frederick ferried his forces into Anatolia. The old emperor, nearly 70, led from the front. At Iconium Konya in May 1190, he smashed a Seljuk force and took the city, clearing the way to Cilicia. Then fate intervened. In June, as his column threaded the ravines near the Salef-Gurksu River, Barbarossa attempted to ford or bathe, sources differ, and drowned. A shock like that unstrings an army. Morale collapsed, disease and desertion scissored the ranks. His son Frederick of Swabia shepherded the survivors to the Syrian coast, but the German king's death stole the Third Crusade's heaviest hammer. The siege of Acre would become the crucible for the Crusade's other 2 kings. The place had been ringed since 1189, when King Guy of Lusignan, freed by Saladin after Hattin, threw a noose around the port and dared the Sultan to break it. Battle lines froze in a deadly embrace, Crusader camps choking the landward side, Muslim garrisons inside, Saladin's field army encircling the besiegers. Disease, mud, and hunger ground through both rings. From the sea, supply and hope trickled in, first contingents from the Italian cities, then the survivors of Barbarossa's column. Guy, eager to justify his crown, which many questioned after Queen Sibylla's death, needed Acre taken to prove he still ruled a kingdom at all. In the spring of 1191, the royal tide arrived. Philip II of France landed first. Richard of England was delayed by storms, a stop in Sicily, and a detour that would shape the East, the conquest of Cyprus. Blown to that island and insulted by its usurper Isaac Komnenos, Richard stormed ashore in May, captured the island in weeks, and turned it into a logistical gem, grain, timber, a safe harbor for fleets. He wed Berengaria of Navarre there, then sailed to Acre under a banner that now promised a steadier supply line than any Crusader host had enjoyed since 1099. At Acre the kings brought order and rivalry. Philip backed Conrad of Montferrat, the hard, brilliant savior of Tyre. Richard backed Guy of Lusignan, the crowned loser at Hattin who needed a city to lift his name. Engines rolled, sappers dug, crossbowmen on wheeled mantlets traded quarrels with archers on the walls. Mines were lit, towers groaned, garrison sorties fought like knife thrusts in alleys of rubble. In July 1191, after nearly 2 years of siege, Acre capitulated. Terms were stark. Saladin would pay a vast ransom, return the true cross, and hand over high-ranking captives. The Crusaders would release their prisoners when the first payments were made. Weeks passed, envoys rode, delays mounted. Richard, facing supply burdens, disease, and the need to move before autumn, made a brutal calculation. On August 20, he marched roughly 2,700 Muslim prisoners from Acre to a field and had them executed as Saladin's army watched from a distance. Medieval war had always bled. This was theater as well as punishment, meant to shock, to simplify logistics, and to warn the Sultan that stalling would cost lives. Muslim chronicles recorded the horror, Latin ones recorded the necessity. The Crusade marched south. Richard's campaign from Acre to Jaffa showed a kind of genius that never touched Jerusalem only because it understood why not. The army advanced in a box, infantry shields and crossbows on the inland flank, cavalry poised behind, the coast to their right anchored by the fleet, which shadowed the march with food and water. Saladin harried them mile by mile, looking for a mistake, a gap to jam with horse and arrow. Near Arsuf on September 7, 1191, he found his chance, or thought he did. Clouds of skirmishers poured arrows into the Hospitallers and infantry on the inland side, trying to draw a premature charge that would unravel the march order. For hours Richard held his men with iron patience as drums beat and arrows whined. Finally the pressure snapped. The Hospitaller master, wounded and enraged, launched a charge to clear the tormentors. Richard unleashed the cavalry in support, timing the release like a spring. Knights crashed through, wheeled, and struck again. The Muslim line bent and failed. Arsuf wasn't annihilation, but it was a needed proof. Saladin's army could be beaten in the open by a disciplined advance and a sudden, controlled strike. Jaffa opened its gates. The coast from Tyre to Jaffa, the vitals of Outremer, were now secured. Twice in the months that followed, the Crusaders marched inland toward Jerusalem, once in winter to Beit Nuba, close enough for scouts to see the holy city's walls through rain and cloud, once again in summer 1192. Twice Richard turned back. His reasons were not cowardice but arithmetic. To take Jerusalem was one thing, to hold it was another. The army lacked horses and men to garrison a city so far from the sea. The roads would be cut. Saladin could starve them out and retake the prize with the first reversal. Winter mud swallowed carts, disease sat in tents, and politics, as always, bit like rats. For while Richard fenced with Saladin, he also fenced with Europe. Philip had already sailed home, ill and intent on carving into Richard's lands in France. In England, Richard's brother John stirred ambitions like embers. Every week spent before Jerusalem's walls risked losing a kingdom an ocean of land away. Richard tried an audacious diplomatic path. At Ramla and Lydda, he and Saladin's envoys, especially the Sultan's brother, Al-Adil, explored a marriage between Richard's sister Joan and Al-Adil, with Jerusalem as dower and a condominium over the holy places. It was clever theater, too clever for either camp's clerics and emirs. The idea died the death of anachronism, but it shows a truth. Both leaders preferred gains they could keep to glories they would lose. Saladin probed for weakness instead. In July 1192, he struck Jaffa by surprise and took most of the town. Richard, offshore with a small force, executed one of his wildest feats. Landing through the surf with a handful of knights and crossbowmen, he counterattacked street by street, barricading alleys and rallying garrison fragments until the city's seaward half held. Days later, on the plain outside, Saladin massed for the kill. Richard formed his infantry into tight blocks, crossbowmen reloading behind pavises while cavalry darted from the flanks. A feigned retreat, a sudden wheeling charge, and the Ayyubid line wavered. The Sultan broke off. Jaffa survived. By late summer, both commanders were exhausted. The Crusaders had secured the lifeline of the coast and proven they could not be ejected. Saladin had kept Jerusalem and most of the interior and proven it could not be taken without ruin. In September 1192, they concluded the Treaty of Jaffa, a truce of 3 years and 8 months, the coast from Tyre to Jaffa in Latin hands, Ascalon's walls dismantled, and crucially, guaranteed access for unarmed Christian pilgrims to Jerusalem's holy places. The cross would return to the sepulchre as a prayer, not as a banner. Richard left the east knowing what he had and had not done. He had not retaken Jerusalem. He had saved the shell of a kingdom, its ports, its arteries, and carved for it a breathing space. He had given the Latin East time to live, to trade, to fortify, and to hope for another chance. On his journey home, he fell into the hands of Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had offended at Acre, and was handed to the Emperor Henry VI. The ransom demanded was colossal. England paid, legend inflated. Saladin, too, barely outlived the truce, dying in 1193 in a house bare enough to make the point. He had spent his treasure on war and endowments, not on palaces. The Third Crusade did not restore the world of 1099. It did something subtler. It stabilized a frontier. It cemented the myths of two rulers who fought each other hard and sent each other doctors, fruit, and horses. It taught Europe a strategic lesson it would not always remember, that Jerusalem taken without a plan is Jerusalem lost in the next season. and it set the stage for a century in which coastal strongholds, Acre above all, would be the Latin East's lungs. But other forces were at work. Italian bankers and shipmasters counted coin. Emperors in Germany and kings in France watched each other with more hatred than they watched Cairo. Popes still dreamed of crusade, and merchants dreamed of contracts masquerading as vows. The next great army to march under the cross would not go to Jerusalem at all. It would follow debt and politics to the richest Christian city in the world and break it open. When the call for a new crusade went out at the turn of the 13th century, Pope Innocent III imagined a purified war, disciplined, papally directed, and aimed straight at Egypt, the key to Jerusalem. What he received was a story of contracts, debt, and diversion, where ledgers mattered as much as letters of indulgence. The Fourth Crusade would never reach the Holy Sepulchre. It would end, instead, with Christian swords flashing beneath the domes of Constantinople. The plan began sensibly enough. Gather the host in Venice, charter a fleet large enough to land an army in Egypt, and break the Ayyubid power at its root. Venice bid for the job with breathtaking confidence. Ships and crews to carry roughly 33,500 men and 4,500 horses, provisions for a year, all for the colossal price of 84,000 silver marks. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, octogenarian, nearly blind but sharp as a hawk, put his city to work. Forests vanished into masts and oars, slipways groaned with hulls, warehouses filled with biscuit. The Republic paused trade for months to build an armada for Christendom. Then reality arrived. Far fewer crusaders than promised reached the lagoon in the summer of 1202. Some took other ports, others delayed. When the muster was counted, the crusade could not pay its bill. They were tens of thousands of marks short. Venice had emptied its calendar and coffers. It wanted payment in silver or in kind. Dandolo offered a solution just worldly enough to be irresistible. Help Venice capture a rebel city, and the debt would be eased. The target was Zara Zadar, a Christian port on the Dalmatian coast that had slipped from Venetian control into the orbit of the Hungarian crown. The Pope forbade it emphatically. No crusader soared against a Christian city, but hunger, debt, and momentum pressed. In November 1202, the Crusader fleet filled the bay, banners unfurled, engines rumbled. Zara fell after a short siege. The sack was limited, but the violation was plain. Innocent excommunicated the Crusaders and the Venetians. Later, he would lift the sentence for most of the host, but the moral stain remained. From the start, the crusade had been bent by finance. Winter in Zara brought a new temptation. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, arrived with an offer that glittered like a shortcut to both money and mission. Restore him and his blind father to the throne in Constantinople, he promised, and he would pay 200,000 marks, provision the crusade, provide 10,000 Byzantine troops, maintain 500 knights permanently in the Holy Land, and submit the Greek Church to Rome. It was everything the Crusaders needed, and everything they wanted the Pope to hear. It was also a dagger pointed into the heart of a Christian empire still nursing the wounds of 1187. There were misgivings. Some leaders, most famously Simon de Montfort, refused and walked away. Many stayed. The army sailed east in spring 1203, not to Alexandria but to the Bosporus, to unseat emperors and collect pledges of gold. On the June horizon rose the city that had dazzled and exasperated Latin pilgrims for a century. Constantinople, ringed by the Theodosian walls, its harbors bristling with chains and towers, its skyline crowned by Hagia Sophia. The Crusaders established themselves across the Golden Horn, allied with their Venetian ferrymen. Fireships and boarding bridges clashed with the city's sea walls. Assault ladders bit at landward towers. Inside, the reigning Emperor Alexios III, uncle and usurper, blinked in the light of his own irresolution. On July 17, 1203, the Venetians took a section of the sea wall. Crusaders forced a gate. Panic rippled through the palace. That night, Alexios III fled with treasure. The city toppled in a scramble rather than a stand. The victors installed their candidate, Alexios IV, beside his restored father Isaac II. Then promises came due. The treasury could not yield what the young emperor had pledged. To scrape together payments for their allies, the new regime melted ornaments, taxed hard, and paraded union with Rome in ways that inflamed the streets. Latin priests celebrated in Hagia Sophia. Processions proclaimed papal supremacy. Byzantine pride, already raw from humiliation, boiled. Meanwhile, crusaders, unpaid and restless, camped outside the very city they had made and began to help themselves to its hinterland for fodder and firewood. Accidental fires, one of them catastrophic, consumed great quarters of Constantinople, feeding fury with flame. By winter 1203–1204, the alliance had curdled. Anti-Latin gangs roamed, palace conspirators whispered. A hard man rose from the shadows, Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Murtzouphlos for his heavy brows. In January he led a coup, deposing the Angeloi and taking the diadem as Alexios V. The young Alexios IV was strangled in prison. Isaac soon died. The new emperor rallied patriots to the walls and refused to honor the dead man's promises. He had a city to save, and no money to buy off an army he despised. The Crusaders, boxed between debt and rage, chose one last heave. In April 1204 they launched a full assault. Venetian galleys, their prows armed with siege bridges, smashed into the harbor walls again. Marines swarmed up, flags snapping, drums pounding. On land, towers creaked forward under a storm of stones and fire. For hours the defense held. Then a cluster of sea-wall towers fell in a rush, and a gate swung wide. Latin knights burst into the quarter, panic unfurled. Alexios V fled. On April 13, the greatest Christian city in the world fell to an army that had taken the cross for Jerusalem. What followed lasted 3 days. Chronicles from every side record scenes that sear. Palaces stripped to marble, silks and chalices piled like harvest. Relics, skulls, splinters, caskets carried off to the west. The bronze horses that once crowned a hippodrome arch shipped eventually to St. Mark's in Venice. Icons torn from wall, citizens enslaved, women violated even in churches. Hagia Sophia was profaned, its altar looted, its floor made sticky with crime. Pope Innocent, learning of the sack, wrote words of fury and grief. Then, in the realpolitik of aftermath, recognized the new reality. A Latin patriarch would sit in the city. A Latin emperor would wear a borrowed crown. They parceled the corpse. A Latin empire of Constantinople was proclaimed. Baldwin of Flanders, courageous and mild, was made emperor. The Venetians took a lion's share of ports and quarters, islands and warehouses, vigilant custodians of profit. The Crusader barons divided what remained of Thrace and Greece into duchies and counties with feudal names that sounded strange in Greek ears. Meanwhile, Byzantine survivors established successor states: Nicaea in western Anatolia, Epirus in northwestern Greece, Trebizond on the Black Sea, vowing to reclaim what had been lost. From the Crusades' point of view, the ledger closed with ships, silver, and a throne occupied by men who owed the West. From history's point of view, it opened a catastrophe. The schism between Greek and Latin, brewed slowly for centuries, curdled into hatred. The Byzantine defense system, the fine web of diplomacy and power that had checked invaders for a millennium, was shredded. Although Michael VIII Palaiologos would retake Constantinople in 1261, the empire he revived was thinner, poorer, and haunted. A door had been opened that others would eventually walk through with ease. None of this had freed Jerusalem. The path to Egypt lay forgotten beneath ledgers and ashes. When later crusades formed, the fifth at Damietta, Frederick II's diplomatic venture, Louis IX's holy stubbornness, they would inherit a Levant where the Latin hold clung to a few strong ports and monasteries of stone. They would also inherit an Orthodox world that remembered 1204 more bitterly than 1187. If the Third Crusade had forged legends of knightly duel and negotiated truce, the Fourth forged a parable of how vows can be unraveled by hunger, pride, and debt. It is a story uncomfortable to tell and impossible to ignore. a crusade that never saw Jerusalem but remade the map of Christendom. From the quays of Venice, where contracts were signed in a counting house glow, to the nave of Hagia Sophia, where prayers were drowned by boots, the Fourth Crusade traced a line from ideal to appetite. And beyond it, on the Nile and in the hill forts of Palestine, the Mamluks were rising, soldier-slaves who would one day crush what remained of Outremer. If the Third Crusade had carved a breathing space along the coast, the century that followed would test whether breath could become life. Europe marched again, more than once. But while crosses were stitched anew, a different power was hardening in Egypt, forged from regiments of soldier-slaves whose discipline and purpose would, at last, close the book on Outremer. The Fifth Crusade opened with an old lesson half learned. Egypt, not Jerusalem, was the hinge. Take the Nile, the argument ran, and the Holy City would follow as tribute. In 1218–1219, a large army of crusaders, joined by contingents from Hungary, Austria, and the Italian ports, laid siege to Damietta, the gateway on the delta. The Nile fought for the defenders. Bridges of boats snapped, towers toppled, the tide itself seemed an enemy. Then the river fell, and after a year of mangonels and fevers, Damietta's walls cracked. November 1219, the city fell. Banners were planted, bells pealed in Europe. The victory brought a fatal choice. Egypt's Sultan Al-Kamel offered terms astonishingly generous: Jerusalem and wide swaths of Palestine restored, a long truce and the return of prisoners, in exchange for Damietta and peace. King John of Brienne urged acceptance, but the papal legate Cardinal Pelagius, stiff with principle and convinced Cairo could be taken, refused. In 1221, the Crusader host pushed up the Nile toward Mansoura. Al-Kamel opened dikes, fields turned to lakes, supply lines vanished into mud. Trapped in flood and encircled by Egyptian forces, the army capitulated, Damietta was handed back, and the crusade slunk away under truce. Pride had traded Jerusalem for swamp and lost. What swords would not win, diplomacy briefly did. The next crusade arrived without trumpets. Emperor Frederick II, excommunicated, learned, maddening, sailed east in 1228. Rather than battering cities, he bargained with Al-Kamel, now again secure. The Treaty of Jaffa, 1229, returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth to the Franks. Muslims retained the letter 1E25 Ar-Am al-Sharif, Temple Mount, and military control of the approaches. Frederick crowned himself in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. No clergy officiated, then sailed home to face wars with the Pope. It was a truce written in ink, not in stone. 15 years later, in 1244, a storm of Khwarezmian mercenaries, displaced by the Mongols and hired by Egypt, swept down, sacked Jerusalem, and together with an Egyptian army, annihilated a joint Frankish-Damascene force at La Fourby near Gaza. The Latin East's field strength never recovered. A saint king tried to reverse fate by will. Louis IX of France launched the Seventh Crusade in 1248, again against Egypt. He took Damietta in a brilliant landing, June 1249, and pushed toward Cairo. At Mansoura in early 1250, impatience broke the plan. Louis's brother, Robert of Artois, charged through a breach with Templars and a vanguard, plunged into the town streets, and was cut off and destroyed. Days of brutal house-to-house fighting followed. The Egyptian army, trembling with palace intrigue after the death of its Sultan al-Letter 1E63 A Macron, Li Letter 1E25 Ayyub, steadied under new commanders, including a hard-eyed officer named Baybars. At Faraskar, disease, hunger, and encirclement forced Louis to surrender. He ransomed himself for a staggering sum, yielded Damietta, and instead of sailing home in disgrace, remained in Acre until 1254, rebuilding walls, reforming courts, and wiring money and men into the skeleton of a kingdom that refused to die. While Louis rebuilt, Egypt remade itself. In 1250, the Ayyubid dynasty that had ruled since Saladin gave way to its own guards. The Mamluks, professional slave soldiers, largely Kipchak Turks bought young, converted, and trained in barracks along the Nile, killed the new Sultan Turancha after a palace quarrel. For a moment, a woman ruled. Shajar al-Dur, the Sultan's widow, whose name echoes like a footnote of steel. Then the Mamluk emirs settled on a solution, their own. Ibak first, then after him al-Mu letter 1E93 a FFORQU letter 1E6DUZ, and beside them, rising step by deliberate step, Baybars. History, obliging no one, brought a second storm from the east. In 1258, the Mongol Ilkhan Hulagu sacked Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliphate, spiritual roof of Sunni Islam, fell. Aleppo and Damascus bent or broke. Franks watched with a mixture of dread and hope, signing truces with the advancing Mongols or opening their ports to them, wondering if the enemy of their enemy might become a savior. It was the Mamluks who answered instead. In September 1260, at letter 2 BF Ay in Jalat in the hills of Galilee, Qutuz and Baybars ambushed a Mongol detachment, used feigned retreat and tight reserves, and broke what had seemed an unstoppable tide. The Mongols would return in later years, but the spell was broken. The Mamluks had defeated the terror that had erased empires. Baybars took the throne later that year. Qutuz died on the road home, stabbed in a coup, and began to hammer the Latin East with a method that felt like fate. He built a courier post that flew news across his domains, reorganized armies, outfitted a navy, and tested each link of the Frankish chain. He preferred speed and surprise, treaties broken the hour they expired, and sieges that bled the garrisons white before a final storm. In 1263 he struck Nazareth. In 1265 he took Caesarea and Arsuf. In 1266 Safed fell after a grim defense. In 1268 he captured Jaffa and far to the north, the city of Antioch, the pride of the First Crusaders. Antioch's fall was apocalyptic. Its walls breached, its population slaughtered or enslaved, its ruler Bohemond vi powerless. A Latin principality that had stood since 1098 vanished in a week. Stone answered, then fell. The great castles, those stalactites of faith and fear, could not defy a state that had learned how to take them. In 1271, Baybars brought crack des Chevaliers, the Hospitallers' mountain ship, to surrender after months of pounding, and a forged letter that convinced the garrison their masters had ordered capitulation. Montfort and other towers followed. Acre remained, bulked by sea walls, Italian fleets, and a population as mixed as any city in the Mediterranean. The English Prince Edward, later Edward I, came in 1271 on what Crusade counters call the Ninth, raided bravely and negotiated a short truce with Baybars. It preserved the coast. It did not turn the tide. When Baybars died in 1277, the Latin East exhaled, then felt the breath catch again. His successor Qalawun continued the work with colder patience. He tightened truces to buy time for cobbling siege engines. When terms lapsed or embassies failed, he moved. In 1285 he took Markab, the Hospitallers' volcanic bastion guarding the Syrian coast, after tunneling and fire. In 1287 Latakia fell. In 1289, after a determined siege, the city of Tripoli, capital of the Second Crusader county, was smashed and burned, its harbor choked with wreckage, its people scattered. The county of Tripoli, carved from the stone of Raymond of St. Gilles's vows, became ash. Europe still tried. Louis Ix had launched one more effort in 1270, the Eighth Crusade, but political schemes bent it into a landing at Tunis, far from Jerusalem. Disease scythed the camp. The Saint King died of fever on African soil, murmuring the name of the city he had not seen, Jerusalem. His death and the campaign's aimless end left Outremer with sympathy but without salvation. Embassies to the Mongol Ilkhans produced hopeful letters and occasional joint raids, but no grand pincer closed on Cairo. Italian fleets fought each other as readily as they ferried troops, and rivalries inside Acre, between communes, orders, and barons, turned the last sanctuary into a parliament of grudges. By the late 1280s, the map of the Latin East looked like a broken necklace. A few bright beads, Acre, Tyre, Sidon, strung along a coast ruled by ceasefires and tariffs, facing an interior that belonged to the Mamluk sultans. The military orders still rode. They would fight until the keys ran red, but numbers and logistics belonged to states, and the Mamluk state had learned every lesson war could teach. When preachers in Europe spoke of a new crusade, they were answered by budgets and dynastic wars. When envoys pleaded at Cairo, they were answered by patience and siege engines. Tripoli's fall made the end plain. Qalawun turned next toward Acre, then the beating heart and market of what remained. He died in 1290 while preparing the campaign. His son Al-Ashraf Khalil took up the plan. Inside Acre that same year, a riot sparked by newly arrived Crusaders who attacked Muslim merchants during a truce gave Cairo the pretext it preferred. The Franks had broken the peace. The great army began to muster. Timber was hauled, ropes twisted, stones shaped, iron shod. The roads behind the Mamluk host filled with carts and the hum of victory anticipated. 2 centuries after Clermont, Outremer had become a lesson written on stone. Courage without cohesion will buy time, not triumph. Castles without a country will fall when a country decides they must. And yet, the last garrison still looked to sea and counted sails. Pilgrims still came, weeping at the sepulchre. Merchants still bargained in the shadow of church towers and minarets. Children still played in alleys named for past glories. History's verdict had not yet been read out loud. The final chapter would be short, furious, and absolute. By the spring of 1291, the map of the Latin East was a string of bright beads on a tightening noose. Tripoli had fallen 2 years before. Along the coast, Acre, rich, quarrelsome, crowded, remained the last true capital of Outremer, its harbors jammed with Genoese, Venetian, and Pisan masts, its streets a babel of orders, communes, and barons. In the summer of 1290, newly arrived Crusaders, undisciplined and eager, attacked Muslim merchants during a truce. Cairo demanded justice. None came. The Mamluk Sultan Qalawun declared war, then died while preparing the campaign. His son, Al-Ashraf Khalil, finished the work. In April 1291, the horizon turned to wood and dust. The Mamluk host, tens of thousands, with siege trains that creaked like forests in motion, rolled down the coast and ringed Acre with a belt of earthworks. Engines rose, counterweight trebuchets whose slings could hurl stones the size of millstones, fire pots, and iron-capped bolts that chewed towers. Sappers tunneled beneath the curtains while storming parties assembled mantlets and scaling ladders. Behind them stretched the calm administration of a state that had learned how sieges are won. Engineers assigned sectors, scouts marked weak points, supply caravans pulsed like arteries from the Nile. Inside, the defenders were a mosaic. The king of Cyprus, Henry II, ferried over men and money and briefly took command, then sailed back to secure his island, leaving the city to its factions. The orders held the walls. Templars under Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu, Hospitallers under Jean de Villiers, Teutonic knights in their quarter. Alongside them stood the barons of the remnant kingdom and the quarrelsome communes of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. Refugees packed churches, merchants stacked bales, shipmasters loaded and unloaded in a frantic rhythm as if commerce could outpace fate. Acre's defenses were formidable, double sea walls, high landward curtains reinforced with towers, and outer suburbs like Montmusard in the north fortified as a second skin. The Mamluks set to work peeling those skins. Their trebuchets, named with piety and bravado, pounded day and night. Saps went in under the accursed tower and other key points. Timbers shored tunnels. Fires set beneath brought down masonry with a groan like thunder. The defenders replied with their own engines, countermines, sorties at night, and crossbow storms from parapets. For weeks the city held. In mid-May, the first major breach opened on the northern face near Montmusard. The Mamluks surged, the Hospitallers countercharged, the line buckled and sprang back. Jean de Villiers, fighting in the melee, took wounds that would force his evacuation. On May 18, before dawn, horns blew along the entire perimeter. Al-Ashraf Khalil threw in everything, storm ladders, rams, sappers lighting the last charges beneath weakened towers. The roar broke like surf. On the east wall by the St. Anthony Gate, the Templar Master Guillaume de Beaujeu rode in full mail to plug a gap. Arrows hissed like rain. One slipped beneath his arm through the seam of the hauberk. He swayed in the saddle, blood-soaking silk. Seeing him pull back, frightened townsmen shouted that their captain fled. He turned, lifted his visor, and answered with the line that would nail him into the city's memory. Je ne m'enfuis pas, je suis mort. I do not flee, I am dead. He was carried from the wall to a church, where he died at vespers. The breach widened. Elsewhere, the Mamluks forced the ditch and seized a tower. Defenders fell back to an inner line. Panic sprinted ahead of news. In the harbor district, terrified civilians surged toward ships, families shouting names against the crash of stones. Some vessels cut cables too soon and capsized under the crush. Others stood off the quays to avoid being swamped, filling boats with women, children, and wounded, while soldiers on land fought to the last yard to keep a corridor open to the sea. By afternoon, organized defense frayed into islands of resistance, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and militia knots holding crossroads and gates for as long as breath and arms allowed. The Mamluk storm then rolled through the streets. A few commanders negotiated pockets of evacuation. Many could not. Fires broke out. Roofs collapsed. The clangor took on the dull edge of an ending. As the sun slid down the massed forests in the harbor, the city that had been Europe's eastern market and monastery became a slaughterhouse and prize. Some fought on behind stone meant for sieges of another age. The Templar Quarter, a compact fortress at the harbor's edge with its own massive tower and sea gate, gathered thousands, brothers, soldiers, townspeople who had not reached ships in time. They hauled up provisions and braced doors. Their galleys slipped out by night with evacuees as long as the sea gate held. Al-Ashraf, unwilling to feed men into a grinder, chose patience. Engines battered the Templar walls while sappers gnawed at the footings. After days of pounding, a negotiation opened. Safe conduct for women and children, hostages offered as guarantee. The first groups were ferried out under watch. Then something, panic, zeal, or treachery, snapped the thread. A Mamluk party that had entered as supposed guarantors was attacked. Fighting reignited inside the outwork. The Sultan ordered the tower taken. The final storm of the Templar keep ended in catastrophe for both sides. Undermined foundations, hammered by weeks of shot, gave way. A section of the great tower collapsed in a roar, killing attackers and defenders together in a tomb of dust and stone. Those who remained inside were cut down. A handful slipped out by sea with the last light. When the sun rose again, the flag on the Templar tower was gone, replaced by the banners of Cairo. In the weeks that followed, the last beads broke from the string. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Haifa, some evacuated in haste, some stormed when their garrison sailed. The iron bastion of Shayd al-Pelerin Atlet, pride of the Templars, was abandoned and evacuated by night. Tortosa's island outwork at Ruwad would hold on until 1302, but the mainland was lost. The military orders regrouped offshore. The Hospitallers to Cyprus, then to Rhodes 1309 and Malta 1530. The Teutonic Knights turned their swords toward the Baltic. The Templars, rich and suddenly purposeless, would be destroyed by a king who coveted their gold and feared their independence. Acre's fall was more than a military defeat. It was the end of a world that had learned, however uneasily, to weave Latin, Greek, Armenian, Arab, and Syrian threads into a garment that could be worn at market and at mass. In its courts, a baron could plead the assizes in French while a Greek scribe copied the judgment in his own hand. In its churches and synagogues and mosques, prayers rose on different days under the same sky. The fall did not erase those people. Many fled to Cyprus or into Mamluk lands as artisans and merchants, but it ended the political experiment that had given them space. For Cairo, Acre was a vindication of the Mamluk system, discipline, logistics, and a willingness to finish what was begun. For Europe, it was a shudder and a shrug. Letters went out, pulpits thundered. A few expeditions launched short, misdirected, or too late. The age of monarchs riding east for Jerusalem was over. New wars and new prophets crowded the stage. On the quays of Acre after the storm, the Mamluks pulled down walls, toppled towers, and scoured the ground so that no enemy could make a nest there again. The sea lapped against smashed piers, lifting splinters and carrying them out into a darkening Mediterranean. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships beat for Cyprus with survivors on their decks, soldier monks wrapped in blood-stiffened cloaks, widows with children asleep against their knees, merchants with keys they would never use again. The Crusader century had ended not with a banner planted, but with a city erased. 2 centuries had passed since a pope at Clermont had promised remission for a pilgrimage of steel. Between those cries and this silence lay Nicaea and Antioch, Hattin and Arsuf, parliaments of barter and nights of prayer, wax seals and broken oaths, saints and sinners and the stubborn hope of ordinary people. Acre's ruins wrote the last sentence on stone. The rest, memory, argument, and legacy, would be written in books. After Acre fell in 1291, the sea closed over the Latin East like a tide coming in. Galleys beat for Cyprus, chancelleries went quiet, fortresses that had claimed whole horizons were scraped to their footings. And yet the Crusades did not end so much as change address. The people who had lived beneath those banners carried them home in memory, law, debt, and legend. The aftershocks rolled on for centuries. Power shifted first to islands and orders. The Hospitallers made Cyprus their base, then seized Rhodes in 1309 and later still Malta, turning the sea itself into a fortress. The Teutonic Knights sailed north and built a crusade on the Baltic, casting stone into new snows. The Templars, rich, networked, indispensable, became victims of their usefulness. In 1307, King Philip IV of France arrested them, and in a trial that mixed envy, fear, and theater, the order was dissolved. Their banking methods and ledgers survived them. The idea of a transnational brotherhood with ports, vaults, and letters of credit had been proven. Finance had always stalked the Crusade story just behind the hymns. To move thousands across continents required new habits, indulgence taxes, crusade tithes, and papal legates counting coin, maritime contracts that split risk and profit between shipowners and investors, bills of exchange that let a pilgrim deposit wealth in Genoa and draw it again at Acre. The Italian republics did not invent their mercantile genius in crusade harbors, but there they refined it. Venice and Genoa built empires of warehouses and privileges that outlived Outremer itself. In the long run, those habits helped Europe look outward, first to Atlantic islands where sugar plantations took root, then across oceans. Warfare, too, learned new grammar. Concentric castles, rings within rings, became the late medieval ideal, a lesson hammered into stone at cracked des Chevaliers, Belvoir, and Marcab. Siege machines grew in size and precision. Counterweight trebuchets hurled ruin with mathematical grace. Sappers mastered the slow art of undermining. On the field, the crossbow and disciplined infantry blocks quietly changed the balance between knight and foot. None of this belongs to one side alone. Byzantines, Latins, and Ayyubids traded techniques even as they traded blows. To tour a European fortress in later centuries is to walk hallways laid out by engineers who had studied Syria's hills. Knowledge did not flow only through tutors and courts in Spain and Sicily. The roads to the Levant carried it too. Arabic scientific and medical texts, Greek philosophy preserved and commented upon by Muslim and Jewish scholars, instruments and methods in astronomy and navigation. These seeped into Latin libraries through traders, translators, and physicians who had bartered remedies and manuscripts in Acre's alleys. The compass and astrolabe were Mediterranean travelers. The numerals that made debellentry bookkeeping sing came from the same wide world. No one caravan delivered a renaissance, but the long tangle of contact mattered. The church learned hard lessons, then forgot some. Innocent III believed he could yoke penitence to policy and produce a holy instrument. Later popes learned to attach the crusade to causes far from Jerusalem, against heresies in Languedoc, pagans in the Baltic, rivals in Italy. The crusade as a specific pilgrimage with a single horizon gave way to crusading as a tool, indulgence-backed war in the pope's register. Monarchs, who had once bowed beneath preachers' words, now bargained or refused. They built their own centralized states while papal authority crested and then ebbed. If Clermont had briefly made Christendom feel singular, the later Middle Ages made it particular. French, English, Aragonese, each crown counting its own costs. Relations among Christians were not healed by shared banners. The Fourth Crusade sack of Constantinople in 1204 tore a wound between Greek and Latin that centuries of polite theology could not close. When Byzantium fell in 1453, grief in the Orthodox world carried the memory of 1204 almost as keenly as the cannons of maimed II. The schism had not been born in the Crusades, but there it acquired flesh and anger. Meanwhile, in the Rhineland in 1096 and in later panics, Crusade preaching became a fuse for anti-Jewish violence. Bishops who tried to protect their communities sometimes failed, and Europe learned an ugly habit it would not soon unlearn. In the Islamic world, the Franks, al-Faranj, were remembered not only for slaughter but for contracts, truces, and a long, stubborn presence. Jurists wrote rulings on trade with them. Chroniclers measured their courage and their cruelty. Jihad, sharpened by Nur al-Din and Saladin and institutionalized by the Mamluks, became a language of legitimacy as well as of war. The Ayyubid and Mamluk states learned to mobilize logistics on a continental scale, to crack stone that thought itself immortal, and to keep the coast clear for centuries. When the Ottomans rose, they inherited a region whose military schools were rebuilt around these lessons. Not everything is ledger and law. The Crusades wrote themselves into story. Western romances filled with armored kings and desert sons, Richard and Saladin locked in a duel of honor that historians know was really a duel of supply lines and letters. The Holy Grail wandered into the mythic landscape. The Templars, first practical, then persecuted, became magnets for every whispered secret. In the East, the memory of Hattin and of Saladin's entry into Jerusalem became part of a moral identity. Victory through patience, magnanimity as policy, faith tempered by statecraft. To this day, political speeches rummage the past for those symbols. Crusade and jihad are words alive with centuries of echo. Their careless use can turn history into fuel. It is tempting to frame 200 years as a clash of civilizations. The record resists that simplicity. Allied patrols of Franks and Damascenes ambushed Aleppans. Venetian brokers priced pepper for Muslim caravans. Byzantine emperors bargained with Turks to check Normans while preaching unity to popes. In the same year, a Templar column might burn fields near Nablus, and a Frankish baron contract a Muslim mason to repair his gatehouse. Terrible things happened, many by intention, some by inertia. So did ordinary things. Markets open at dawn even after siege horns sound at night. Pilgrimage, which had lit the first fire, did not die with the last walls. Under the Mamluks and later the Ottomans, treaties and tolls let streams of unarmed travelers return. In 1342, the Franciscans were made official custodians of the Latin holy sites. Greek monks kept their own long vigils. Armenian clergy chanted in their chapels. The city that had been the center of war reverted to what it had been for 1,000 years, a place where people came to touch stone and weep. What then did the Crusades leave behind? A Mediterranean more entangled than before, a Europe that had practiced moving armies and money over oceans and that, in later centuries, would cross wider ones. A Near East whose rulers knew how to mobilize state power against stone and sail alike. A Christianity more fragmented in practice and more centralized on paper. An Islam whose scholars and sultans had found a common narrative in defense that would, in time, face new empires. And in between, families whose ancestors had been poolings in the Levant or merchants in Amalfi, whose bloodlines ignored the borders their chronicles defended. At the beginning of our story, a pope on a hill promised remission to those who took up the cross. At its end, on a hot morning in May, a sultan's cannonball shattered a tower. Between those two moments lies a human truth larger than doctrine or iron. People make meaning out of journeys. The Crusaders called theirs a road to paradise. Their enemies called it invasion. Their grandchildren called it legend. The roads met in cities that still breathe, Antioch, Jerusalem, Acre, and in books that still argue. If you stand today on the bluff above Acre and look out to sea, you can imagine the masts packed so tightly you might have walked from ship to ship, and beyond them the blue edge into which survivors disappeared. The wind off the water smells of salt and tar, of prayers and ledgers. Somewhere far inland, the twin rocks of Hattin crouch over a dry valley. Somewhere farther, the churches of Jerusalem hold cool shadows. The Crusades are over, but the dust of their roads still clings to the stones of two continents. And every time we ask what faith and power can do to one another, what they should do, we walk that road again.